Hi, this is Maggie from Design Code Debug Repeat. If you're a beginning programmer, a beginning game programmer, a beginning data analyst, a programming teacher, or if you just find this content interesting, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be posting lessons, tips, and cool programming stuff regularly. Today I was remembering a really fun exhibit that used to be at the Museum of Science in Boston called the Virtual Fish Tank. And I love simulations and I love aquariums, so I really loved this exhibit. And at this exhibit, visitors to the museum could basically change sliders and settings to create a fish with particular characteristics. And then they could release that fish into the virtual fish tank at the museum. You could also create and release a fish from home. It had an at-home interface as well. And you can see in these images examples of what the virtual fish tank looked like. So I thought it would be really fun to implement something, just a proof of concept that is like the virtual fish tank, using a particular design pattern, the subject observer design pattern. And what I have here is just a link to the Wikipedia article about the design patterns book by the Gang of Four, and the subject observer design pattern is described in this book, and it is an excellent book. If you're a beginner, I also describe the pattern in my book, Objects and Games with Python. And I have an example in Python of a very simple implementation of the subject observer pattern. So basically with this pattern, you have two classes, and you can have as many objects as you need, of course. But with the class, the subject is some sort of object whose state might change. And the observer is some sort of object that needs to get updated when the subject's state changes. So the subject, here's an implementation of a very simple version of this pattern. The subject is going to maintain a list of its observers, and observers can send the attach message to the subject to get added to the list, or the detach method to get removed. And again, this is just a specific implementation, so it's not necessarily a list, but in this case, it's a list. The subject maintains some kind of reference to all of its observers. And then the subject will notify all of its observers if its state changes. So the observer can attach itself to the subject, and then when it finds out through the update message that the subject's state has changed, it will then change its state accordingly. So the way I was thinking this would be used in a game is, for example, if you had, say, non-player sprites, characters of some sort, elements moving around in your game, and they're going to react to things in the environment. Maybe other NPCs, maybe the player character, or maybe just objects in the environment. So for example, with the fish in the virtual fish tank, you could program them to like or dislike bubbles. And then if there was something in the fish tank that produced bubbles, like for example, I think there was like a treasure chest that would open and bubbles would come out. If the fish liked bubbles, it would move towards the treasure chest, but if it was afraid of bubbles, it would move away. So I thought that was the sort of behavior that I would like to implement using this subject observer pattern. So I thought I would have something in the environment that has states, so let's say bubbles, no bubbles, and then NPCs like the fish that are moving around in the environment that are going to register with the subject to find out whether it's emitting bubbles or not. And when it does emit bubbles, if they're the sort of thing that likes to go towards bubbles, then they're going to change their direction of movement and move towards the thing. And if they don't like bubbles, then they're going to change their direction of movement and move away. But there's so many different ways that this could be used. So for example, If they're going to try to, let's say, collect the gold before the player can collect the gold coins, then maybe they register with the gold coins, and when one appears, they start moving towards it. And if they get to it before the player gets to it, then they get it. That sort of thing. Or maybe they register with the player and they move towards or away from the player. It depends on your game and what sort of elements you have in the game, but I thought it would be a fun way to give your NPCs something that appears to be somewhat intelligent behavior using this pattern. So I'm going to try to implement something, I'm going to go with the bubbles, no bubbles fish model, and we'll do that, but understand that this could be expanded and changed. It's the pattern that we're interested in, not the specific context. Okay, I've written a very, very simple game for us to work with. I got the images from Wikimedia Commons. It doesn't look good. Looks like a screensaver, a bad screensaver, but what we've got is a fish that is going to move around in the tank, and all it does is move and boundary check. When it hits a wall, it just changes both its dx and dy. But if I press the space bar, the chest bubbles and the fish moves towards the chest, or adjusts its dx and dy so that it's moving towards the chest. Okay, so that's all that does, and let's just take a quick look at the code. So in main, basically we're just creating, a window, and then we create an object of class fish and a fish group to hold it, an object of class treasure for the treasure chest, and a group to hold it. And then right now I am processing a spacebar by telling the chest to bubble and telling the fish to move to the treasure chest, and then the usual clear, update, draw, and flip. Now the fish, I have a bubble affinity field, but we're not using that yet. And so basically all we do is it randomly chooses a dx and dy. It's also randomly choosing a bubble affinity. And I have the move to treasure, so it's just calculating the distance to the treasure from itself and changing its dx and dy accordingly. And in update, it's just adding its dx and dy, and then boundary checking and changing direction if it hits a boundary. With the treasure, it's basically got two images, the bubbling and the non-bubbling, and it's got some fields for keeping track of whether it's bubbling or not and how long it's going to bubble. When we press the spacebar, it gets this bubble message, which just changes those fields. So it changes its image and it says bubbling to true. And then in update, if it is bubbling, we just work with a timer so that after max bubbles plus 1 second, we stop bubbling. So we can work with this and use our subject observer model to, instead of having the chest bubble and the fish move toward the chest when the user presses the space bar, we can have the chest bubble randomly. It's a subject. When it changes state, either bubbling or not bubbling, it can send its observers, in this case the fish, a message. So subject has to keep track of a list of its observers. So subject is treasure. Okay, so we initialize that to the empty list. And then we'll have attach, detach, and notify. We also have to be able to give up our state so that the fish knows the state. So we'll have some methods for that too. So I think the only thing is we don't want to call this update because we already have an update method which is part of pygame, right? Part of the pygame whole drawing cycle. So we will call it update, or maybe we can call it observer update. Okay. So within the fish, which is the observer, actually it's subject update. Let's call it subject update. just want to change that to subject update. Okay, so I would preferably have a superclass for subject and a superclass for observer, and then I wouldn't have to have these methods attach, detach, notify, or the list of observers. That would all be in the superclass, and Treasure would just inherit from it, and all it would do is notify its subjects when it's been modified, when its state has changed. And we would do that in Bubble, right? Well, we would do it in Bubble and also in Update if we stop bubbling. So let's say self.notify. All right, we're going to notify all of our observers if we start bubbling, and if we stop, self.notify. So in both cases, either we start bubbling or we stop bubbling, and maybe that should be out in a separate method, but for now I've got it down here. Then the fish will be notified. Okay, so let's say let's do if not self.bubbling, and then we'll put this in an else. So if we're not bubbling, then we're going to set self.bubbling equal to random.randin, I don't know, 1 to 5 equal to 1. All right, so if we're not already bubbling, then we'll randomly decide. I probably want to make that bigger, because I'm thinking we're going to get in here 30 times a second, so that's way too much opportunity. So let's make it 300. That's a little more than what I was thinking before, but let's just see how that works. So there's always a random chance that we're going to start bubbling. Okay, so, and we're notifying. Okay, so then the question is, so what is the fish going to do? So first of all, we need to register. The fish is an observer. It needs to register with the subject, or it's never going to get the message. So let's pass the observer in here to the initializer. And let's make it a field. And treasure dot, and what we want to do is attach, and we're going to pass our self into that whatever fish object is being initialized, we're passing it into treasure to attach, so that we get the message subject update. Okay, so if we get subject update, it means that Treasure's state has changed. So we need to know if Treasure is bubbling or not. So I think we need to be able to ask it. So if self.treasure.bubbling, then we're going to move toward the treasure. So let's make that a method. So we need ways for the observers to be able to get at our state. So this is one, self bool, and we're going to return self.bubbling. We also need to be able to give our center X and center Y so that the fish can calculate its vector, its direction. So def get X self is an integer, oops, and we'll do the same thing for Y. Okay, so if it's bubbling, then we're going to move to treasure and pass in self.treasure.get X. Did I get X? self.treasure.get y. I really need to pay more attention to the names I give things. Yep, okay. So if it's bubbling, we're going to do that, and otherwise, let's change our direction. So let's do this. Go back to our normal motion if it stops bubbling. Okay, so subject update, if it's moving, move to treasure. Okay, so now with the move to treasure, here I was multiplying by 5, but what I'd like to multiply it by is bubble affinity, which is randomly, actually we won't do that yet. Bubble affinity is randomly generated, so either the fish is going to move toward or away, and let's make those 5. So it might not care at all. It's going to be randomly generated between -5 and 5. Might not care at all. It might generate a 0. It might really hate bubbles. That would be -5. And it might really like them. That would be 5. But for now, we are going with the really like so that we can see if this is working. So instead of sending the fish to move to treasure message here, we'll still let the user make the chest bubble by pressing the space, just so we can test whether our subject observer model is working. And I am actually going to pause the video for a minute uncharacteristically and read through my code and see what mistakes I've made. There were a few mistakes. Let me go through them quickly for you. I haven't defined treasure yet, so I couldn't use it in an annotation here. And when you're in that situation, use quotes to annotate. So there were 2 places where I had tried to annotate that. For some reason I passed fish in here, which is not a thing that's defined here, instead of self. And then there's something I'd forgotten to do down at the bottom. I think this is, I'd forgotten to switch the order because I needed to pass chest into the fish constructor. So I need to switch the order and pass that in. And I think that's it. Okay, and that's moving super slow. Let's do this. Okay, so I can't tell if it would have changed direction after it stops. That's okay, so it's moving towards, it stopped, good, and it changed direction. So it changed direction, notice, without bouncing on any wall or anything. It changed direction because it got the update from the subject that its state had changed. So it sees bubbles, it's excited, it moves towards the bubbles, and then when the bubbles stop, it goes back to moving in a random direction. Now, one thing I notice is that the treasure chest is not, we're not randomly generating bubbles, so that number was probably way too big that I put in there. Where was that? Let's try 30. And then what I'd also like to do, I don't like to change too many things at once, but what I'd also like to do is instead of multiplying by 5, I want to multiply by self.bubble affinity. So I do want to see a fish that's afraid or maybe indifferent. Where is it? Okay. And this should randomize that a bit. And I'd like to put a bunch of fish in there. Let's put several fish in, and that way, let's see, is there any time we need to deal with fish? No. Okay, so let's just do, for I in range, let's make 10 fish. And then fish equals the fish. We'll create the fish group before this. And fish group.add fish. And that should be fine. We don't need to keep a reference to a fish down here. And this way we get more fish. And so we get the option for them to have different attitudes toward the treasure chest. So why are they all starting in the same location? I am not too sure about that. I thought I was randomly generating a location, but I'll have to look in to see what the problem is there. And we're still not getting any random bubbles. So, could we tell if there were any that really hated the treasure chest? Let's see. Oh yeah, that one. That one was moving away. So let's watch this one right here. He really doesn't like the treasure chest. Yep, he's moving away. Let's see, now he's going to get closer. Oops. Wait a minute. They are randomly changing direction. Okay, so something's going on. Something's going on in the update of treasure, which is telling them that its state has changed so it's notifying when it shouldn't be notifying. So it should only notify if it was bubbling. Let's see, if not self.bubbling. Self.bubbling. Oh, I guess I think what's happening is it's bubbling, but I'm not showing it. So if self.bubbling, self.bubble, I think that's what's going on here, because I'm not sending the actual bubble message. So yeah, that's the problem. So it might be bubbling actually a lot more than I realized. Oh yeah, there we go. I'm not pressing. It's bubbling too much. Yeah, let's go back to the old one. We still have to fix where all those fish are generating from. Okay, so yep, some are definitely afraid and some are moving toward. Yeah, this makes more sense. Yeah, okay. Alright, that works. So this might not look like super intelligent behavior to you, and it's partly because the fish are terrible and not animated well and the whole thing is not very attractive, but picture it looking nice and imagine if we got the numbers adjusted correctly so that maybe the fish move a little more quickly. So we might want to adjust the affinity numbers so that the fish move much more quickly or have the potential of moving much more quickly towards the chest. And I actually think the amount that it bubbles is okay, but rather than having it bubble randomly, we might also want to have it on a cycle. Yeah, I think that's kind of cool. So imagine it's a monster and some of your NPCs are attracted to the monster and some of them are afraid, and the monster comes in the room and now they're getting in the way of the player character. Or I think that there are a lot of possibilities for how to use this architecture. And if you were going to use it a lot in a game, again, I would say make a superclass subject and a superclass observer so that your actual subject class only has to give up its state and it only has to notify, but it doesn't have to manage the list of subjects. That would be up in the superclass. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like this sort of content, please subscribe to Design Code Debug Repeat. I post instructional videos, tips, and other cool programming stuff regularly. The code for this example, once I fix where those fish generate, will be available on my GitHub repository. There will be a link in the description. If you want to talk about this code, please comment in the comment box below. I will get back to you. And if you have suggestions or ideas for future videos, please ask me in the comments. If I can accommodate you, I will. Take care.